Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Audrey, and today I'm going to share with you my family's top 3 favorite bread recipes. We'll start with our whole wheat bread. First, add 3 cups of warm water to the mixing bowl. To that, you will add 1/3 cup of honey, 2 tablespoons of yeast, and 5 cups of bread flour. I've discovered over the years that it's pretty important to leave the bread flour to whole wheat flour ratio exactly how it is in the recipe. If you don't add enough whole wheat flour because you're using 2/3 a cup of honey in this recipe, your bread ends up really sweet. Now you'll turn your mixer on, get it all well combined, and then you'll let it sit and sponge for 5 to 10 minutes. Turn your mixer on just long enough to combine all of your ingredients. You don't want any pockets of flour that haven't been mixed in with the water. You can see how much the dough has risen and there are little bubbles forming on the surface. That is a good sign that it's ready for the next step. Now we're going to add another 1/3 cup of honey, 3 tablespoons of melted butter that is slightly cooled, and a tablespoon of salt. We're also going to add 2 to 3 cups of whole wheat flour, but we'll add it a cup or 2 at a time, turning the mixer on in between each addition so that you will see when your dough begins to pull away from the sides of the bowl, knowing you've added just the right amount of flour. It's nearly impossible to give exact, precise measurements of flour in a bread recipe. A lot of it depends on the weather for that day. If there's a lot of humidity in the air or it's raining outside, I typically need a good bit more flour than on days when it's dry. The best way to become a great bread baker is to just do it. The more you do it, the better you'll become at reading your dough, understanding how much flour to add, and you may even decide to tweak the amounts of sugar, salt, and butter that you add to each recipe. I lightly spray the insides of the mixing bowl so that the dough doesn't stick as it begins to rise in the oven. Transfer your bowl to an oven that either has just the light on inside, or in my case, I have a bread proofing feature on my oven, and it just barely warms the oven and encourages the dough to rise a little faster than if there was no heat at all. Take your dough out of the oven and you're going to punch it down and try to get the air pockets out. In this case, I'm just pulling it away from the sides of the bowl so that I can begin to pull chunks off and form them into rolls. There's not really an art to this. You just have to decide how exactly you want to form your rolls. I'm really not particular when it comes to spacing them out. You just want to make sure you leave room for them to rise. I have a double oven, so while my rolls are rising in the bottom oven, I go ahead and preheat the top oven to 350. Once your rolls have just about doubled in size, it's time to move them to your preheated oven. My rolls typically take between 20 and 25 minutes, so I just keep an eye on them once I pass the 20-minute mark and pull them out when they start to turn golden on top. Surprisingly, this simple, no-knead overnight bread is my family's favorite. It reminds me of a crusty artisan bread that you'd be served in an Italian restaurant to dip in olive oil, balsamic vinegar, and cracked pepper. You start with a large bowl and 9 cups of flour. I typically use about 5 cups of freshly ground whole wheat flour and 4 cups of bread flour. Add a 1.5 teaspoons of yeast, 5 1/4 teaspoons of salt, and 4 1/2 cups of water. I make sure my dry ingredients are mixed well before I add the water. Stir them until they're well combined and there's no dry flour left at the bottom. Cover your bowl tightly with plastic wrap and leave it on the counter for 6 to 24 hours. The longer you let it sit, the more the flavor is going to resemble a mild sourdough. You'll know your dough is ready because it will have risen in the bowl and you'll see lots of bubbles similar to a sourdough starter. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees with your Dutch oven and lid inside the oven. I carefully turn out my dough onto parchment paper on the counter. I'll carefully pull the Dutch oven out of the oven and place the parchment paper and dough inside, trimming the edges so that I can place the lid on. You're going to bake your bread with the lid on for the first 30 minutes. Then carefully remove the lid and continue baking uncovered for the remaining 10 minutes. Because we're baking this bread at such a high temperature, I usually go ahead and take it out of the Dutch oven and set it on a cooling rack. Good luck waiting until it's cool to cut into it. Now for our third and final bread recipe. This is my simple Amish white bread. You start with 3 cups of warm water, 3 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 tablespoon of yeast. I let that sit for just a few minutes and let the yeast start to foam. You'll know the yeast is developed when it looks like smooth foam on top instead of seeing the little yeast granules. Next, you're going to add 1 tablespoon of salt and 3 tablespoons of melted butter that you've allowed to cool just slightly. I let mine cool a little too long and it needed a little encouragement out of the dish. Now we're going to add the flour. I prefer bread flour, but all-purpose flour works just fine. You're going to add 1 to 2 cups at a time and make sure you're mixing thoroughly between each addition. You'll know you're getting close to the end when the dough starts to form a large ball and begins to pull away from the sides of the bowl. At this point, I like to spray the inside of my bowl just a little bit so that it doesn't stick to the sides of the bowl as it rises in the oven. Now it's time to let it rise. You can either cover it with a cloth napkin or a tea towel on the countertop and let it rise there, or you can put it in the oven with the light on or on the bread-proof setting until it has doubled in size. I like to clean my counter off really well, spray it with a little nonstick spray, and dump my dough straight onto the counter. There's no sense in dirtying a cutting board or anything extra. Now at this point, I'm not really kneading it as much as I am just kind of squeezing it and pushing it around. You want to get the air bubbles out so you don't end up with Swiss cheese bread with lots of big holes. I kind of form it into one large loaf so I can cut it in half pretty evenly. Now I take 1/2 at a time and pretty much do the same thing that I was doing before. Roll it up a little, squeeze the air bubbles out. Sometimes you can see those little air bubbles start to come to the surface, and I might just take my fingers and pinch them to let the air out. Sometimes that's not enough and I can tell there's more air in them. And that's really a good thing because that means you've gotten a really good rise out of your dough and it's going to be light and fluffy. So I make sure I've squeezed as much air out of the loaves as possible before forming them and putting them in the pan. I'm not really looking for perfect loaves. Some people will roll them out with a rolling pin and then roll the dough up almost like a cinnamon roll and stick it in the bread pan, but this method works just fine for us. Now we're going to stick it back in the oven to let it rise for a second time. I actually had to go pick some of my kids up when this was rising a second time, so I just covered it with a tea towel and let it rise on the counter, and it was perfect and ready to go in the oven when I got back. For this recipe, we actually preheat the oven to 425. As soon as you stick the bread in, reduce the temperature to 350 and let it bake for 25 minutes. That produces perfect loaves for me every time. I really hope this video was helpful and encourages you to take the leap and start making your family's bread more often. Maybe you are a longtime bread baker but haven't had time lately. Try the overnight NoKnead bread. There's just something about pulling hot bread out of the oven. It makes the entire house smell good and the people come running. Just make sure you have a stick of butter that's soft and ready to go. Let me know in the comments if you try any of these recipes. Thanks for watching.